Hello, and welcome to another Wild Shots video tutorial. I'm your host, Paul Burwell. In today's tutorial, I thought we'd take a look at how a photographer can use one of my favorite plugins, Viveza from Nik Software, to do some light modifications. Sure, it would have been great if in the field I could have had an assistant working with a reflector to get some light onto the face of the cat that you see on the screen in front of you, or if maybe I had some auxiliary lighting that I could have used to fill that in. But is often the case when we're photographing wildlife, and in this case it's lynx walking towards us, we don't always have a whole bunch of control over the light. And so we're going to look at the way that we can use Nik Software's Viveza tool to do light modification after the fact. Okay, so I've got this image of the lynx loaded up into Adobe Lightroom version 3.4. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move into the Develop module in Lightroom. Now my first instinct when I run into this type of issue with dark shadows and that type of thing is to maybe give a try to the fill light slider. And if I grab that fill light slider and move it to the right, sure enough, if I get it up around 75 or 80, I can get the left side of that face, that shadow, filled in pretty nicely. But look what it does to the rest of my image. It totally washes it out. Generally adds an unappealing look to the overall image. So that's not what I want to do. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into Viveza from Nik Software, and I'm going to do that through Photoshop. To edit this image in Photoshop, I'm going to right click on the image, I'm going to go down to the Edit In menu, and I could choose right at the top here, Edit in Adobe Photoshop CS5, and that would work fine, but I'm going to instead choose Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Now I'm doing that because that's going to give us a lot more flexibility in the future. So I'll choose that. And here's my image in Photoshop itself. Now I'm going to launch the Viveza tool. So I'll go up to the Filter menu, go down to Nik Software, and choose Viveza 2. Here we are in the Viveza tool. You can see that in the tool up at the top here, I've got some icons that can give me some before after sort of views of the image I'm going to work on. I've got this very handy preview switch, which I'm going to use a lot to see what I started with and where I am now. The primary tools we're going to be using are over here on the right hand side of the screen, where we can use something that Nik calls control points. And these control points are super useful and make it extremely fast and efficient to do the light modification to this image. So I've gone over here to the right hand side of the screen and I've clicked on Add Control Point. The way the control points work is when you drop them down on a particular color tone, and if you look at the bottom right hand corner of the screen where it says loop right now, that shows you a close-up of exactly where the cursor is positioned with a little target. That helps you position it when you've got a high resolution picture like this. That's about the tones that I want to affect with this control point. So I'm going to click my left mouse button. That's going to drop down a point. You notice if I hold my left mouse button on this control point that's been dropped down, that it puts up a circle. And I think of that as a circle of influence or sphere of influence. And I can size that sphere with this slider that's right beside it. And basically I'm going to adjust the size of that sphere so that it's including the shadows on the cat's face, on its shoulder, and on its leg. Because I'm going to want to brighten all of them similarly so that the modification that I'm going to make is going to look as natural as possible. And in fact, I'm going to expand it to even include the shadow on the rear end of the cat. Okay, so now I'm presented with a number of different sliders that I can adjust. I've got a brightness control, contrast control, saturation, structure for bringing out fine details, shadow control, warmth, red, green, and blue values as well as the hue. And you can see here that I can just use the shadow tool. I can pull that to the right, and it's doing a lot of what happened in Lightroom. But the big difference is it's just affecting similar color tones within that sphere. It's not affecting the whole image and washing out the whole image. And you can see that in the background here, when I turn off the preview, there are some areas that got brightened inadvertently because they're similar color tones to where I dropped that point down on the cat's face. And we're going to see how we can correct for that really quickly in a second here. Besides using this shadow adjustment, the other thing I'm going to want to do is anytime we add light to a dark underexposed area or an area that's in shadow is we're going to lose some contrast there. So I'm also going to use the contrast slider to bring back some of that contrast that's missing. You don't want to go too far or you get this odd look to things. So I'm going to leave this probably at around 8% or so. And then I'm always going back to my preview switch to make sure that things look okay, that I haven't gone too far. The other thing that happens when we use the shadow control to add light to an area like that is we tend to lose saturation in those colors. So I'm going to take that saturation slider and just boost it up a bit. The other thing I might play with for a second is just this warmth slider. A lot of times shadow areas start off as quite cool with quite a blue cast to them. So I can use the warmth slider to counteract that a bit. And again, we don't want to go too far with it. Instead, I'm going to leave this probably at about 15 to 20%. And again, it's back to that preview tool again to see a before and after sort of look at things. That's starting to look really good. I'm not happy with what it's done to the background here, but overall, I'm happy with the way things are looking. Our next step is to get back some of those shadow areas that were inadvertently brightened by the use of this control point. And the way I do that is I go over again to the right-hand side of the Viveza tool, and I click Add Control Point again. This time I'm going to add a control point on one of those shadow areas that was affected that I didn't want to be. So I'm just going to drop that down. Again, I can size it if I want to. And now if I go and compare where I am now to what I started with, you can see that still got a bit of brightening of the background here, but primarily the brightening is left to the left-hand side of the cat's face. You can also take a look at the foot that was in shadow and see how it's brightened up and how some of the details are coming out there now with the spots on the cat's legs and also on the rear end. Okay, that's looking pretty good. The other thing I might want to do while I'm in here, and this is a trick that portrait photographers use and a lot of wildlife photographers use to just boost their pictures' impact a bit, and that's we might want to enhance the eyes just a bit and make them pop. And I'm going to zoom in first on the eyes of the cat so that I can really see what I'm doing. Go and grab a control point, add a new control point. I'm going to drop that down right on the iris of the cat. And I need to get my select tool back. I'm going to size my circle of influence here so that's just a bit bigger than the cat's iris. Now I'm going to use the brightness slider just to brighten that up a bit, maybe about 15%. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm in here is I'm going to boost the saturation because brighter, more saturated colors in the eyes really help our viewers connect with our images because it's through the eyes and it doesn't matter whether it's a person or if it's a dog or if it's wildlife. Any of those type of situations where you've got a photograph and the main subject of it has eyes, your viewer is going to connect to that subject through the eyes. And so if we can use a couple of little tricks to make it easier for the viewer to connect with our photographs are going to be better for it. So there, I brighten up the iris of the eye. I've still got this other eye on the left-hand side that's still a bit in shadow, and I don't want to totally get rid of that shadow because that would look unnatural. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to duplicate the control point that I just created that enhanced this eye on the right-hand side. So I'll go over to the right-hand side of the Viveza tool. Underneath the control point list, I'm going to click on duplicate, and it's going to duplicate whichever control point is active. And I can tell that this control point on the eye of the cat is active because it's got the expanded menus for me to use the sliders on. So I'll choose duplicate, and it's going to create a duplicate control point, and I'm just going to move this over here to the left-hand side of the cat, and I can just move it around to see where it has the most impact. And on this eye, I might even brighten it up just a bit more. And again, I'm always going to jump back and do a preview of before and after just to see where I've come from and where I've got to, just to make sure I haven't gotten too far and started to make things look artificial. And that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to zoom out so that I can see the overall view of the image, and I did that by using the standard Photoshop shortcut key, which is Control-0 or Command-0 on a Mac. And now I can go back up to my preview button and just get an overall view of the entire image. And I'm liking what I'm seeing there. You can really see how just that quick use of this Viveza tools really opened up the left-hand side of the face on the cat. Now I'm going to finish this off, so I'm going to click OK. That looks really, really good. And if I take a look here in Photoshop, I can see over on my layers palette, which I've got positioned on the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see that it is a smart object, and you can see that Viveza works with smart objects. And the big advantage of that is I can save this as a PSD file or a layered TIFF file, and I can come back to it at some point in the future. And if I want, I can just come in here and I can double click on the Viveza 2 filter, and I can go back in and I can decide maybe I want to brighten up the left-hand side of the face a bit more. So I've got all my existing control points in there. So I could activate that control point that was on the left-hand side of the face that I first dropped down by clicking on it. And then I could come in and decide maybe I want to boost the brightness just a bit on the face and decide, okay, that's what I want to do, and click OK. Photoshop will reapply that Viveza filter, and here we go. One thing that I've found is that after I do some of this adjusting of the images, especially when I'm working with bringing out the shadow areas and that type of thing, I find that my image is lacking just a bit of contrast. So I'll just show you a quick trick of how I get that back in Photoshop. I'm going to go up to the layer menu, and I'm going to go down to new adjustment layer, and I'm going to choose curves, and I'm going to call this mid-tone adjustment. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm in here is I'm going to change the blending mode from normal to luminosity, because with the mode set as luminosity, any adjustments that I make are only going to affect the brightness or darkness of the image. They're not going to affect the color tones, and that's what I want to do here. So I'm going to click OK, and on the right hand side I've got my adjustments panel up here now for that mid-tone adjustment layer. And I found that there's a preset that's built into the curves adjustment layer called linear contrast. And when I choose linear contrast, if you look over on the right hand side, you can see it's built just a very slight S-curve, where it's just boosted our bright midtones and it's darkened our dark midtones. And if I take a look at what that's done to the image by turning on and off the visibility eyeball beside that layer, you can see it just pops in that extra bit of contrast that helps the image look really, really good. From here, I can save this as a PSD file and return to Lightroom. Okay, so here's my edited version of my image back into Lightroom. The only other thing I might do to this image before I decided to print it or post it on the web or email it to somebody is I might want to use a trick with the vignetting tool that's built into the develop module in Lightroom to help focus the viewer even more onto my subject. And the reason I might do that with this image is because there's a lot of clutter here in the foreground and a bit in the background that can be a bit distracting to the viewer. And I always want to make sure that I can direct the viewer to look exactly where I want them to first in the image. And so to add this vignetting effect, what I'm going to do is I'm in the develop module. I'm going to slide down the right-hand side of the different panels that are in Lightroom here, and I'm going to go down to effects where we've got the post-crop vignetting, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide that amount to the left-hand side, which is going to darken up the corners of my image, and I don't want to do it too much so that it's overly obvious, but if I put this at about minus 20 or so, I think it looks pretty good. Play with the midpoint where that vignetting starts. I move it out just a bit. Play with the roundness of the vignetting. Leave it about there. The feathering or the transition between what's vignetted and what isn't, I'm going to leave that alone. And the highlights we don't need to worry about here, because none of the highlights that I'm vignetting out I'm at all concerned about. And there I go. There's my finished image. The last thing I thought I'd do is just take a quick look at the photograph we've ended up with and what we started with. So to do that, I'll just use the survey mode in Lightroom. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see I've got the finished image with the light modification to those shadow areas on the left-hand side of the face. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the before image, or what we started with. And I think you can agree that those modifications that we made using Viveza and Lightroom, which together, if I was zooming through it and not talking, could have been accomplished in much less than 2 minutes, are pretty substantial and make for a much better image. So what I've done here is some serious light modification in the post-processing without having to have an assistant running around with reflectors or we're trying to set up lights, neither of which typically work well for wildlife photography. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on using the Viveza plugin from Nik Software for enhancing some of the difficult shadow areas in your images. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop me a line on my blog where this tutorial will be posted, or you can always send me an email to paul@paulburwell.com. Thanks. We'll see you again.